Okay guys, so in this video we are going to be going over sharecropping and slavery, just like that was in your packet for this week. In this video we're going to read both of the passages for sharecropping and slavery and highlight some of the main content in these passages. So listen closely. If you weren't able to get to the passages, this video will help you with your work. So here we go. In 1865, slavery was abolished. Former slaves were left wondering how they would build a life for themselves and their family. After all, many could not read or write. They had few belongings and no money. The plantation owners had to farm the land. The landowners also lacked money to pay workers. As a result, this mutual problem led to a system of farming called sharecropping. With sharecropping, a landowner allowed a poor farmer to use part of his land to grow crops. In return for allowing the poor farmer to use the landowner received a large portion of the profits for the sale of the crops. Sharecropping was not specific to former slaves. Many poor white families also began farming on the other people's land in order to try and make ends meet. The landowners and the poor farmers, also called sharecroppers, signed contracts that detailed their agreement. In many cases, the landowner might provide the land and the housing. The sharecropper would then have to borrow money from the landowner to cover the cost of seeds, tools, mule, and other equipment. Okay, so at this point, the sharecroppers had to borrow a lot from the landowner, so keep that in mind. The poor farming families might also need money for basic living expenses until the crops were harvested. If they did need money, they might borrow it from the landowner. Upon harvesting the crops, the landowner would take the entire harvest to sell. Once the money was received from the sales, it would be split between the landowner and the sharecropper. In some cases, the landowner might get 60% of the money and the sharecropper would get 40%. The percent for each might differ from one sharecropping family to another. It all depended on the contract. So not all sharecroppers got 60 or 40%. It depended on each sharecropper and each landowner and what they agreed. Once the sharecropper got their percent of money, they had to first pay back any money they borrowed from the landowner. Not only did they have to pay back the money they borrowed, but they usually charged interest and had to pay that back too. Interest is a rate charged to someone else's money. In some cases, interests were high, very high. It was not uncommon to charge 50 to 70% interest rates. If a farmer borrowed $1,000 at a 50% interest rate, the farmer would actually owe the landowner $1,500 when he paid the money back. Even though the landowners took a large percent of the harvest, sharecropping did provide some economic incentive to poor farmers. If the farmers produced a bigger harvest, they made more money. Once the crops were harvested, though, sharecroppers usually made little to no money. During poor growing seasons, the harvests were smaller and less profitable. Also, if a sharecropper became sick, they might not be able to tend to the harvest. In many situations, the sharecroppers might have to go into debt because they could not pay back all of the money that they had borrowed from the landowner. Despite the negatives, let me scoot it over real quick. So despite the negatives, poor farming families were left with few options during the Reconstruction era. They couldn't afford to live on their own as they had no money for food or housing. Sharecropping provided them with crops for food, a roof over their head, and the chance of earning money. If a sharecropper couldn't pay for the landowner for all the money they owed, they had to stay and work until debt could be paid off. This could take years, and in some cases, the debt was never paid off. If sharecroppers tried to leave without paying the money back, they risked being arrested and going to jail. Because the sharecroppers became so in debt to the landowners, some referred to sharecropping as the new form of legal slavery in the South. Over time, sharecropping declined. New technologies were developed, such as the combine harvester, that efficiently harvested grain crops. This meant landowners needed fewer workers. After World War II, sharecropping almost became non-existent due to many jobs created by the war. Many former slaves also moved north and into growing cities where the industrial jobs were available. So with sharecropping, it was not considered slavery. It was considered there was still landowners and owners of the workers, but workers got their money paid and they were not owned. They were allowed to live their life, but they still had to pay their owners back, and if they didn't, they had to do what the landowner said until they got their debt paid off. Okay, so let's go and let's read the lives of slaves. So remember, slavery was before sharecropping, and this was just a main review of slavery. So, let me zoom back out just a little bit. Alright, so life for enslaved African Americans was very hard. The enslaved had no rights at all. They were people who had been taken from their homes in Africa and forced to come into America, a strange land to them. Here they were forced into slavery where they worked long hours with no pay. Many worked on plantations, others worked on small farms. Some worked in towns and cities. If they broke any rules or tried to resist, they were punished horribly and could even be killed. They were not allowed to learn to read or write or to gather together with their family and friends. They could neither own property nor leave the plantation without the owner's permission. If a white person attacked them, they could neither take them to court nor testify against them. Any children who were born to enslaved women would automatically become enslaved too. Enslaved African Americans were denied their basic human rights of life and liberty. They were treated as property just like animals or tools. They were not allowed to control any of their own lives and were not allowed to be free. One of the most horrible things that happened to enslaved families is that they were often separated. Slave owners would trade them as if they were trading cattle. This means that children were sold away from their mothers, fathers were sold away from their children, brothers and sisters were separated. Many times they were sold to faraway plantations and never saw their families again. Could you imagine being sent away from your family and never seeing them again? Okay, guys, so with slavery, they had no rights. So where sharecroppers, they had rights, but they also had to work. So in a way, slavery and sharecroppers, they both had to work, but with slavery, they had no rights, and sharecroppers had rights. All right, so you should work on your Venn diagram after reading these passages, and we will come back and go over that together.